I'm talking to my buddy Steve Horn from DeSmogBlog, DeSmogBlog.com. Let's move on. You actually have a new piece coming out for Vice about the use of something called Petcoke in Chicago, Illinois. If people aren't aware, what exactly is Petcoke?
Sure. So Petcoke or petroleum coke is a byproduct that is inherent in extracting the Alberta tar sands. When that stuff is extracted, some of the product there is it's not just the oil-like substance that we know of as crude oil. There's also petroleum coke, which it kind of just looks like a dust, a black dust, but it's oily like. It's kind of almost like coal, and it has to be refined into a product that can be used in a power plant to be burned. But in the case of many cities around the United States, initially it was Detroit in the summer, and now it's Chicago. This stuff is being piled up in close to rivers or close to places where it can be transported. And in Chicago, right now, there's a big issue because the stuff is not covered up at all. It's just in a pile. It's next to the Calumet River, which is actually a tributary to Lake Michigan. And right now in the city, there's a big debate going on. Actually, every level of government has weighed in. There's basically a bill proposed in the city government to ban it. There's another one to cover it, and two proposals at the federal level. Representatives and senators have weighed in. Durbin and Representative Robin Kelly have weighed in and are calling for more testing and regulations. And then at the mayoral level, even Rahm Emanuel has called for regulations. So this is a pretty serious issue, and there's actually some concerns with the Rahm Emanuel proposal because it doesn't set in for 2 years. And 2 years from now, who knows what the health impacts will be of this petroleum coke, which is really toxic to breathe in. It's very fine grained. It can get lodged deep into the lungs, and it can worsen asthma. It can cause respiratory illness. We're doing a scientific experiment here because the United States is just for the first time really seeing this petroleum coke boom. And by the way, this stuff actually pretty much just gets exported. It's not used in the United States. It's not burned in the United States because it's so dirty. It's actually dirtier than coal. There's an article in The Guardian where it's referred to as dirtier than the dirtiest fossil fuel. So this is stuff that's primarily exported to China and the global market, other places, but China primarily. And you're seeing a huge petroleum coke import boom in China. And China has all these air pollutions, and we wonder why. Well, the United States is now shipping a lot of the stuff that's causing the air pollution in China.
Let's talk a little bit about because actually the title of the article, you actually it's spelled it's Petcoke, Petcoke, but you actually write about the ties between another Coke, which is the Koch brothers, and how they're tied to Petcoke that's in Chicago. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, and this is interesting because this is not just two Koch brothers. This is three Koch brothers. We have obviously David and Charles Koch. They're well known, and their brother William, but all three of them, he's not as well known. All three of them are involved in the petroleum coke business. The Koch brothers own KCBX and Koch Carbon. KCBX is where they hold their pet coke, and Koch Carbon is the product itself. So the terminal plus the product. They own quite a bit of petroleum coke, and a lot of their petroleum coke, despite their Americans for Prosperity moniker, a lot of the stuff is being exported. I mean, basically all of it's being exported to one of the United States' biggest geopolitical rivals, which is China. And then William Koch, and it's their petroleum coke in Chicago, which is the focus of my story. But just as a sort of an aside, William Koch, their brother Bill Koch, he owns Oxbow Carbon, which is the biggest manufacturer. It's actually the biggest supplier of petroleum coke in the world. And he's really not on most people's radar, but he's in the Forbes 100, so he's very wealthy. And his petroleum coke, obviously, he's the biggest supplier in the world. This is a big product. A lot of it's exported. So all three of them, the Koch brothers triumvirate, are largely behind the Petcoke, PETKOCH boom in the United States.
Crazy. And again, it's like, the one side of like the evil of just using this stuff that is so bad for the environment when we're at this tipping point is one thing. Shipping it to China so they can have this dirty energy is another thing. But then they're just literally just leaving this stuff in an exposed pile in the south side of Chicago, near where people live. And so this this film gets all over them. They're breathing it. The children are breathing it. And this is some nasty, nasty stuff that they just left in a friggin' pile in a city. It just, here's this pile of toxic crap. And how they're even getting away with this is beyond me.
Yeah, and the south side of Chicago is essentially, on behalf of this Petcoke and also other industries, historically, has largely been seen as a sacrifice zone on behalf of industries. This time it's the Petcoke industry. Before it's the steel industry. I think
coal had a giant thing in the south side of Chicago too, obviously.
Yeah. So there's this whole history of that. And I think one huge glaring hypocrisy to point out on behalf of the Koch brothers and kind of the right-wing climate change denial movement in general, which they bankroll, is that they talk a lot about, well, even if we do this, even if we do that on climate change, the real issue is that China is not acting responsibly, and they're not even if we did, look at them, they point the finger at China. Well, it's really, in this case, it's so repulsive because they're supplying this dirtiest fossil fuel known to man, basically, to China, so that they can burn in power plants, and then they point and blame China for the problem that they're creating in China.